The folder hit the desk so hard that the pen holder tipped over, and two people at the nearest workstation looked up. "Denied," said the man who had thrown it. His name was Greg Paulson, senior loan officer at Crestfield National Bank, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had held a small amount of power for a long time and had mistaken it for a large amount. He was 44, soft in the jaw, with the kind of tan that came from weekend golf rather than actual weather. He pointed at the folder without picking it up. "Denied. Closed. Done. Don't bring this back to my desk." On the other side of the desk, a man named Caleb Morrow sat very still. Caleb was 31 years old. He was wearing a shirt that was clean but had been ironed too many times, the kind of shirt where the collar had started to go slightly translucent at the tips. His shoes were polished. His folder, now splayed open on the edge of Greg's desk, contained 3 years of business records for the small landscaping company he had built from nothing, a credit report that was not perfect but was honest, and a loan application for $80,000 that he had spent 2 weeks preparing. He looked at the folder. He looked at Greg. "Can you tell me what the issue is with the application?" he asked. "Specifically?" Greg leaned back in his chair. "The issue is that your collateral is insufficient. Your revenue projections are optimistic to the point of being fictional, and frankly," he glanced sideways toward where another loan officer, a woman named Sandra, was watching from her desk with the look of someone who had seen this before and had stopped finding it funny some time ago. "Frankly, you don't have the profile of someone we'd be extending this kind of capital to." "My repayment history is fine for someone in your bracket," Greg said. "This is a different bracket." Caleb held very still for a moment. "What bracket am I in?" Greg smiled. It was not a kind smile. The one where $80,000 is a lot of money. From somewhere behind Caleb, a small laugh. He didn't turn around to see who it had come from. He kept his eyes on Greg. "It is a lot of money," Caleb said evenly. "That's why I put together a detailed application with 3 years of documented revenue and a repayment plan that accounts for low-season variance." He reached over and straightened the folder on the desk. "Did you read the application?" Greg's expression tightened slightly. "I reviewed it. Because the revenue projection you called fictional is based on 2 existing contracts I have in writing." Caleb pulled a document from the folder and set it on the desk. "Those are the contracts. Signed. Both with municipal clients. Combined value of $112,000 over 18 months. Greg looked at the contracts. He did not pick them up. "Municipal contracts can be canceled," he said. "They can," Caleb agreed. "So can any business arrangement. That's why there's a risk section in the application." Page 7. A brief silence. Sandra, at her desk, had stopped pretending to type. Greg pushed the folder back across the desk. "The answer is no, Mr. Morrow. I'd suggest you look into microfinance options or community lending programs. They're designed for," he paused, with the specific pause of a man choosing his words carefully while not choosing them carefully at all. "Smaller-scale operations." Caleb looked at the folder. He looked at Greg. He picked up the folder, straightened all the papers inside it, and closed it. "Thank you for your time," he said. He stood up, pushed the chair back neatly, and walked out of the office. He did not slam the door. He did not look back. He walked through the open floor of Crestfield National Bank with his folder under his arm and his polished shoes on the marble floor and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man who has been practicing keeping it together for so long that the practice has become the thing itself. He pushed through the glass doors and out into the October air. He sat on a bench across the street and looked at the building for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called his mother. It was a no, he said. A pause. Then his mother's voice, warm and steady in the way it had always been, even when there was nothing behind it to be steady about. "Come home," she said. "I'll make dinner." "Mom." "Caleb, come home." He looked at the bank's glass facade, at the Crestfield National logo above the doors, clean and solid and sure of itself. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Caleb's mother was named Ruth Morrow, and she lived in the same house she had lived in for 32 years, a narrow 2-story on Clement Street with a garden that was the most beautiful thing on the block because Ruth treated it as a serious undertaking rather than a hobby. She had raised Caleb alone after his father left when Caleb was 4, which was a fact of Caleb's life that had long since passed from wound to scar to just History. Something that had shaped him without defining him, he hoped. He sat at her kitchen table while she cooked and told her the whole of it. The folder, the contracts, Greg Paulson's smile, the bracket comment. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he loved most about her. When he was done, she set a plate in front of him and sat across from him with her own coffee and was quiet for a moment. "Did you keep the application?" she asked. "Yes." "Good. You'll need it." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "There are other banks." "I've been to 3. Then there are more than 3 banks." She said it simply, without false brightness, just the flat arithmetic of someone who had been counting resources her whole life and knew that giving up was its own kind of math. "You have the contracts, Caleb. That's real." "I know it's real." "Then keep going until you—" He pushed his food around for a moment. "The way he looked at me, Mom. Like the whole thing was, like it was funny that I was even there." Ruth was quiet. "It wasn't funny," she said. "No. It wasn't about you, either." "Not really." "It was about what he saw when he looked at you, which is a very different thing." Caleb looked at her. "Find someone else who knows it." "You know what your grandfather used to say?" she said. "He used to say that people who judge by the surface are doing you a favor, because it means they'll be wrong about you in the ways that matter most, and you'll always have that advantage." Grandpa was an optimist. Grandpa was a realist, Ruth said. He just happened to understand that reality has a long arc. They ate together in the warm kitchen, and outside the window the October garden held its last color before the cold came, and Caleb felt, for the first time all day, slightly less alone inside the situation. What Caleb Morrow did not know, sitting in his mother's kitchen that October evening, was that 400 miles away, in a hospital room in a city he had not thought about in years, a man was dying. The man's name was Edmund Crestfield. Yes, that Crestfield. Edmund Crestfield had founded Crestfield National Bank 41 years ago with $400,000 in seed capital, an ability to read a balance sheet the way other people read novels, and a stubbornness that his 2 ex-wives, his board members, and his attorney had each described, at various points, as the most exhausting quality in a human being they had ever encountered. He was 77 years old. He had built something from nothing, lost people he loved, made decisions he would do differently and decisions he would repeat exactly, and had arrived at the end of his life with $11 billion and one significant piece of unfinished business. His attorney, a careful man named Howard Park, sat in the chair beside the hospital bed and did not hurry. "The documents are ready," Howard said. "Whenever you want to go through them." Edmund looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Has he been told?" "No." "Per your instructions." "Good." He closed his eyes briefly. "I want it to come from the documents, not from a phone call." Edmund. "I know what I'm doing, Howard." Howard had been Edmund Crestfield's attorney for 22 years and had learned, somewhere around year 3, that arguing with this particular statement was the single most efficient way to waste an afternoon. He picked up the documents. They went through them. An hour later, signed and witnessed and sealed, they were done. Edmund looked at the window. The sky outside was the flat gray of late October. "He doesn't know what he comes from," he said. Not to Howard exactly. To the room. Howard said nothing. "I kept it that way on purpose." "I was wrong about that." He turned his head. "You'll contact him directly." "Not through the firm's main office." "Directly." "Of course." "And Howard." He held his gaze. "Tell him I'm sorry I left it so long." Howard nodded. Edmund Crestfield looked back at the window. He lived for another 9 days. Caleb was at a job site on a Thursday morning when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of directing 2 crew members on a drainage issue along the eastern edge of a municipal park contract, one of the signed contracts from his loan application, and the morning was cold and his coffee had gone lukewarm and the drainage issue was more complicated than the site map had suggested. He answered anyway. "Is this Caleb Morrow?" The voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering significant information in a way that did not cause immediate panic. "It is. My name is Howard Park. I'm an attorney in Aldeville. I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Edmund Crestfield. Are you somewhere you can speak?" Caleb moved away from his crew toward the edge of the park. The grass was wet. The sky was white. "I can speak," he said. "Who did you say?" "Edmund Crestfield. He passed away on October 19th. A pause. "I understand you may not know this name. I'm going to need a few minutes of your time, and I want to ask you to stay on the line even if what I'm about to say is surprising." "Okay," Caleb said. And then Howard Park told him. He sat in his truck for 45 minutes after the call. His crew foreman knocked on the window at some point, and Caleb lowered it and said he needed a few minutes, and the foreman, a steady, unflappable man named Pete who had worked with Caleb for 6 years, took one look at his face and said, "Take what you need, boss," and walked away. Edmund Crestfield had been his father, not the man who had left when Caleb was 4. That man's name was Thomas Morrow, and he was alive somewhere in a different state, and Caleb hadn't spoken to him in 11 years, and he had no money and very little to recommend him. Edmund Crestfield was a different man entirely. Edmund Crestfield had been 23 years old and not yet rich when he had briefly, intensely, and in retrospect consequentially known Ruth Morrow, then Ruth Patterson, during the 2 years she had lived in Aldeville before her own family circumstances moved her back to the city where Caleb had grown up. They had not parted badly. They had simply parted in the way of young people who do not yet know how to hold the things that are too large for them. Ruth had discovered the pregnancy after she left. She had written a letter. The letter had arrived at an address Edmund had already vacated. By the time Edmund found her again, Ruth had married Thomas Morrow, and Edmund had made a decision he would revisit for the rest of his life, without ever being sure if it was right. He had watched, from a distance he had chosen and maintained, as Caleb Morrow grew up. He had watched without intervening, without revealing himself, without using his money to smooth anything, because he had told himself, and perhaps believed, that the intervention would do more damage than the distance. He had been wrong about that too, and had known it and had not corrected it until he ran out of time to correct it any other way. The estate included majority ownership of Crestfield National Bank. Caleb called his mother from the truck. She answered on the second ring. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something." The silence on the other end was different from her usual silences. It had a held quality, as though it had been waiting. "Who is Edmund Crestfield?" he asked. A very long pause. "How do you know that name?" she asked, and her voice was careful in a way that told him, before she said anything else, that she knew exactly who Edmund Crestfield was. "An attorney called me," Caleb said. He stopped. He tried again. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" She was quiet for a long moment. He could hear her breathing. "I wrote him a letter," she said finally, "when I found out about you. He never wrote back. And then I met your father, and things moved fast, and by the time I knew for certain that Edmund had never gotten the letter, you were already 2 years old, and Thomas he was trying, Caleb. He was trying to be a father, and I thought," she stopped. "I thought it was kinder to let what was real be what was real." "You should have told me." "Yes," she said. "I should have." The simplicity of it hit him harder than an argument would have. She didn't defend it. She didn't explain it into a justification. She just agreed, in the quiet way of someone who had been carrying an acknowledgement for a long time and was relieved to finally set it down. "He watched me," Caleb said. "The attorney said he kept track. He knew about the landscaping business. He stopped again. He knew about the loan application, Mom. He knew it was denied." Another silence. "Come home," she said. "Mom. Caleb. Please come home." He drove to Aldeville the following Monday. Howard Park's office was on the 4th floor of a building that was old and solid and smelled like woodwork and paper, and Howard himself was a man in his late 60s who had the specific quality of someone who had seen a great many things and no longer needed to perform composure because the composure had become structural. They sat across from each other at a table covered in organized documents, and Howard walked him through the estate with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Majority ownership of Crestfield National Bank, a portfolio of commercial real estate, investment accounts, trusts, a foundation that bore the Crestfield name but had, according to Howard, been deliberately underfunded and undirected for years because Edmund had never settled on who should be entrusted with it. "He left notes," Howard said. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. Caleb looked at the envelope. His name was written on it in handwriting that was slightly unsteady, the handwriting of a man who had written it near the end. "Do you want a moment?" Howard asked. "Yes," Caleb said. Howard left the room. Caleb opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and it did not begin with an apology, which Caleb had expected, and did not begin with a justification, which he had also expected. It began with a question. "Do you know what I regret most? Not the distance. Not even the letter I never got. What I regret most is that I never got to argue with you. I watched you build something from nothing with no help from me, and I kept waiting for you to fail so I'd have an excuse to intervene, and you never failed, and so I never got to be useful, and I wasted 40 years being useless to the one person I might have actually helped." Caleb sat with the letter for a long time. He read it 3 times. When Howard came back, Caleb's eyes were dry, but his expression had the look of something that had been cracked open and was in the process of figuring out what that meant. "I have questions," Caleb said. "Of course," Howard said and sat down. The questions took most of the day. By late afternoon, Caleb understood the shape of what he had inherited. Not fully, not with the depth that would come from weeks of work with accountants and attorneys and board members, but enough to see the outline. He understood, specifically, that Crestfield National Bank had a board meeting scheduled for the 2nd week of November. He understood that as majority owner, he had a right to attend. He asked Howard what the board knew about the inheritance. Howard adjusted his glasses. "They know Edmund passed and that the estate is being settled. They know, as of this morning, that there is a majority shareholder. They do not know who that is yet." Caleb looked at the table. "When do they find out?" "When you walk into the room," Howard said. "Unless you'd prefer a different approach." Caleb thought about Greg Paulson's folder landing on the desk. The smile. The bracket comment. The 2 people at the nearest workstation looking up at the sound. He looked at Howard. "I'd like to walk into the room," he said. He called Pete from the parking garage of Howard's building. "You okay, boss?" Pete asked, without preamble. "I'm okay." Caleb leaned against his truck. "Pete, I need you to run point on the Henderson site for the next few weeks. I have some stuff I need to deal with." "Personal stuff?"
"Yeah." He paused.
"Big stuff." Pete was quiet for a moment. "You need anything from me? Just keep the Henderson job clean. And tell the guys I said the drainage issue better be sorted by Friday." "It'll be sorted by Wednesday," Pete said. "Go deal with your big stuff, boss." Caleb hung up. He stood in the parking garage for a minute, alone with the October cold coming through the open levels, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of the city. He thought about his grandfather saying that people who judge by the surface are doing you a favor. He thought about Ruth, in her kitchen, saying reality has a long arc. He thought about Edmund Crestfield, who had watched him from a distance for 31 years and had finally run out of time to do it differently. He got in his truck and drove to the nearest diner and ordered coffee and a meal he barely tasted and sat for 2 hours making lists in the Notes app on his phone, because lists were what he did when things were large, and he needed to make them small enough to hold. The Crestfield National Bank Board of Directors met on the 2nd Tuesday of every month in a conference room on the 11th floor, which had a view of the financial district and a table long enough to seat 14, and leather chairs that had cost, Howard mentioned in passing, approximately $1,200 apiece. There were 9 board members. Most of them had known Edmund Crestfield personally. Several of them had been in their positions for over a decade. They were, as a group, the kind of people who wore the authority of institutions the way other people wore good coats, comfortably without thinking about it. The interim chair, a woman named Diane Forsyth, called a meeting to order at 9 a.m. She acknowledged Edmund's passing. She led a moment of silence that felt genuine rather than procedural, because most of the people in the room had actually liked Edmund, which was not always the case with powerful men but was true of him, Howard had said, in a specific and unsentimental way. Then Diane said, "We have a significant item before any other business. As most of you know, the estate settlement has been finalized, and we have a new majority shareholder joining us this morning." She looked toward the door. "I'd like to welcome Caleb Morrow." The door opened.
Caleb walked in.
He was wearing a suit. It was a good suit, not new, but well cut. The kind of suit that had been bought for an important occasion several years ago and maintained carefully. His shoes were polished. He had his father's eyes. Several people would think later, though they wouldn't say it out loud in the meeting. He looked around the room as he moved to the empty seat at the near end of a table. 9 faces looking back at him. 9 different versions of assessment happening simultaneously.
He sat down.
"Good morning," he said. A ripple of greetings. And then, from the far end of the table, a voice that Caleb recognized before he found the face. "I'm sorry, Morrow." Greg Paulson, senior loan officer, who had been invited to this particular board meeting to present the quarterly loan portfolio review, was looking at Caleb with an expression that was doing several things at once: recognition, confusion, and the beginning of something it would take him another 60 seconds to fully identify. "Caleb Morrow?" Caleb looked at him. "Greg," he said. The table was very quiet. Diane Forsyth looked between them. "You two know each other?" "We've met," Caleb said. "Greg processed a loan application of mine about 3 weeks ago." The table absorbed this. Greg's face had gone through several colors and had settled on something in the range of pale. The application was denied," Caleb said. He said it with exactly the same flatness Greg had used. Not loudly, not with heat, just the plain word. It was denied. Another silence. Diane looked at Greg. Her expression was careful and professional, and not particularly warm. "We'll want to look at that," she said. "Yes," said one of the other board members, a man named Arthur Belkin, who had the measured speech of someone who had been in boardrooms for a long time and knew when a sentence didn't need anything added to it. Greg opened his mouth. He closed it. Caleb turned to Diane. "I don't want to get ahead of the agenda. What's first?" The meeting lasted 3 hours. Caleb asked questions. He had spent the last week reading everything Howard had given him: board minutes, financial summaries, quarterly reports, the bank's lending data broken down by neighborhood and demographic, and the questions were specific, which some people at the table noticed, and others were too busy recalibrating to pay attention to. He asked about the small business lending portfolio. He asked about approval rates by loan size bracket and by applicant profile. He asked whether the bank had a community reinvestment review scheduled and when the last one had been completed. Arthur Belkin answered most of these questions. He was thorough and direct, and at some point looked at Caleb across the table with an expression that was part surprise and part something that looked like cautious respect. "You've been reading," Arthur said. "I've been reading," Caleb confirmed. Greg Paulson sat at the far end of the table and said very little. When the meeting broke for lunch, the board filtered out of the conference room in small groups, and Caleb stayed in his seat for a moment. Howard, who had attended as legal counsel, gathered his papers quietly. "That went well," Howard said. "Greg looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor," Caleb said. Howard allowed himself a small smile. "He did." "I don't want him fired," Caleb said. He said it clearly, before Howard could take it in a different direction. "I'm not here for that." Howard looked at him. "What are you here for?" Caleb looked at the long table, the leather chairs, the view of the financial district through the windows. He thought about Ruth in her kitchen. He thought about Pete on the Henderson site. He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, which he had folded and carried with him without being entirely sure why. "I'm here because something was built, and I'm responsible for what it does next," he said. "That's what I'm here for." The lunch was held in the building's executive dining room, a room Caleb had never been in before and which was, he noted privately, considerably nicer than any room he'd had a business meal in. He sat next to Diane, who had the quality of a woman who had been running things in rooms full of men for a long time and had developed a very efficient internal filter for who was worth her time. She spent the first 20 minutes of lunch deploying that filter on Caleb, which he could feel but didn't mind. He understood it. He'd have done the same. "Tell me about the landscaping company," she said. He told her. Not the polished version, but the real version, starting with 1 borrowed truck and 1 lawnmower, and the first contract he'd won by showing up to bid on a municipal job that everyone told him was out of his reach. Diane listened with full attention. "How many employees?" 11 full-time. 3 seasonal. Revenue. Just over 800,000 last year. Projected to cross 1 million this cycle with the 2 new municipal contracts. She looked at him. And Greg denied you $80,000. Based on insufficient collateral and optimistic revenue projections, Caleb said. Diane picked up her water glass. She set it down. The collateral question. What did you put up? The business assets and equipment. The contracts as demonstrable revenue. I have a van and 2 trucks and a trailer and $14,000 in equipment that's less than 3 years old.
He paused.
It wasn't insufficient collateral for the loan size. It was insufficient collateral for who he thought I was. Diane held his gaze. You understand that what you're describing, if documented, is a fair lending issue. I understand that, Caleb said. I also understand that one case doesn't tell you a pattern, which is why I asked for the lending data by demographic in the meeting. She was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Honestly? Someone who'd want to use the first month making everyone in the building uncomfortable. I want to do the work, Caleb said. The other thing would feel good for about a week, and then I'd have a bank in bad shape and an uncomfortable building. Diane almost smiled. Edmund used to say something similar. He used to say that the satisfaction of winning an argument lasts about 15 minutes, and whatever you broke to win it lasts a great deal longer. Caleb looked at her. You knew him well? Or 20 years, she said. He was difficult and brilliant, and he had a tendency to make decisions from a distance that he should have made up close. She paused. He talked about you toward the end. Not by name, at first. But I figured it out. Caleb was quiet. What did he say? He asked. Diane considered the question. He said he'd been watching someone build something real, and that watching had been the most helpless he'd felt in his adult life. She looked at her plate. He wasn't good at being helpless. No, Caleb said. I don't think he was. In the weeks that followed, Caleb moved carefully. He hired an independent firm to review the bank's small business lending data for the past 5 years. He brought in a consultant to assess the community reinvestment portfolio. He met with Arthur Belkin twice a week in working sessions that started at 7:30 in the morning because Arthur was 70 and believed strongly in early starts, and Caleb found he didn't mind. Arthur had worked with Edmund for 18 years. He was not warm in an obvious way, but he was honest in a consistent way, and Caleb found that rarer and more useful. You're doing this right, Arthur said one morning, over the terrible coffee that Arthur made himself in a small machine in his office because he trusted it and did not trust the executive floor kitchen. Am I? You're not moving fast. That's doing it right. He handed Caleb a cup. Edmund moved fast his whole life. Got him most of what he wanted, and cost him some things that mattered more. You mean? I mean your mother. Yes. Arthur sat down. I don't know the whole story, but I know that Edmund had a quality, a lot of the people I've worked with have it, where the decision that's most comfortable in the moment is always the decision to wait. Wait until the business is stable. Wait until the timing is right. Wait until he stopped. Time runs out, Caleb. That's the thing he didn't learn until it was the only thing left. Caleb looked at his coffee. He said in the letter that he wasted 40 years being useless, he said. He wasn't wrong, Arthur said. But he also built something real. Those two things can both be true. I know, Caleb said. My mother says something like that. Your mother sounds like a sensible woman. She's the most sensible person I know, Caleb said. And he meant it. The independent lending review came back 6 weeks after Caleb commissioned it. It confirmed a pattern that Caleb had suspected from the data, not overt discrimination with a paper trail, but the accumulated weight of discretionary decisions that, across hundreds of applications over 5 years, had produced a gap in approval rates for small business loans that could not be explained by creditworthiness alone. He called Greg Paulson into a meeting in the 11th floor conference room. Just the two of them and Howard. Greg arrived already wound tight. He had been wound tight since the board meeting, which Caleb had noticed and not commented on, because there was nothing to say yet.
He sat down.
Caleb slid the review across the table. Greg looked at it. He turned several pages. His face moved through things. I want you to understand something, Caleb said. This isn't about you and me. I want you to be clear on that. Greg looked up. What you did with my application. Caleb held his gaze. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. It did. You looked at me and you made a decision that wasn't about my financials. That's in my application file, and it's going to be part of the review.
He paused.
But this, he tapped the report. This is about a pattern that didn't start with you and won't end with you. You're one officer in a system that produced this data, and the system is what needs to change. Greg was quiet. He looked at the table. I've been doing this job for 16 years, he said. I know, Caleb said. I didn't think I was, he stopped. I thought I was using judgment. That's what they train you to call it. Judgment. I know what they train you to call it, Caleb said. I'm not here to decide what to call it. I'm here to change what happens next. Greg looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this directly? He asked. Why not just? Because you'll be more useful to me understanding the system from the inside than you'd be gone, Caleb said. And because I'm not interested in making an example of you. I've been made an example of. It doesn't fix anything. The silence was long and not comfortable and not empty. Greg nodded, just slightly. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to help me understand where the decision points are, Caleb said. Where the discretion lives in the process. Because that's where the system changes. Howard made notes. Caleb poured them both coffee. They stayed in that room for 2 hours. Ruth Morrow came to Aldeville on a Saturday in December. Caleb picked her up from the train station and drove her to the building that had once been Edmund's, the Crestfield building, all glass and stone, and stood with her in the lobby while she looked at it. She was quiet for a long time. He built this, she said. He did. He looked up at the ceiling, at the height of the atrium, at the light coming through the glass. He was 23 when I knew him, she said. He had $30 in a checking account and a plan on a napkin.
She paused.
He was very sure of the plan. Caleb looked at her. Were you sure? She smiled. It was the kind of smile that has a lot of weather in it. I was sure of him, she said. Which isn't the same thing, but it's enough when you're young. They stood together in the lobby of the bank that had denied her son a loan 8 weeks ago, that now belonged to her son, in a city where a man had built something enormous from a napkin plan and spent 31 years watching the son he didn't raise build something real from a borrowed truck and a lawnmower. Are you angry?
Caleb asked.
She thought about it honestly. I was, she said. For a while. When you called me from the truck in the parking garage after Howard's call, I was angry then, yes. She looked at the floor. But I think anger about the past is the most expensive kind. It costs you the present while you're paying for something you can't change. You have to be the most rational person I've ever met, Caleb said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and sudden. I'm not rational. I'm tired. There's a difference. When you're tired enough, you stop spending energy on the things that are over and you start saving it for the things that aren't. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, the way she had when he was small, and the world was large, and she was his entire evidence that it could be managed. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Howard said the same thing. Howard's right. She straightened up. Now. Are you going to show me this building, or are we standing in the lobby all afternoon? The Lending Reform Initiative launched in February. It was not announced with a press release, which some people expected and Caleb declined to do. It was announced with an internal memo to staff and a letter to the community development organizations in the districts the bank served, laying out specific, measurable changes to the small business loan review process and inviting those organizations to hold the bank accountable to them. It was the kind of announcement that doesn't make you look generous, because it's too specific to be flattering, and Caleb had been deliberate about that. Arthur Belkin, reading the memo, had said, "This is the kind of thing Edmund would have respected and never done." Caleb had said, "Then let's do it." Greg Paulson, who had spent 3 months in working sessions with a reform team and whose detailed knowledge of where the discretion lived in the loan process had turned out to be exactly as useful as Caleb had said it would be, was named to lead the officer training component of the rollout. It was a significant assignment. Several people on the board had raised eyebrows. Caleb had said, "He knows where the problems are better than anyone else." That's not an accident. Diane, at the board table, had looked at Caleb with the expression of someone updating their assessment in real time. Edmund, she said, would have done it the other way. Yes, Caleb said. I know. His application, the original application, the one that had landed on Greg Paulson's desk with 3 years of business records and the 2 municipal contracts, was reprocessed through the new review protocol 6 months after the reform initiative launched, as part of the pilot audit. It was approved. The $80,000 sat in a Crestfield National account for 11 days before Caleb used it to buy 2 new service vehicles and upgrade the equipment trailer that Pete had been complaining about for a year. Pete, upon learning that the trailer was being replaced, said, "It's about time, boss." Caleb told him he agreed. Pete said, "You going to tell me what all this big stuff was you were dealing with?" "Someday," Caleb said. "Is it good big stuff or bad big stuff?" Caleb looked at the new trailer, solid and gleaming in the morning light. "It's complicated big stuff," he said. That turned out to be mostly good. Pete considered this with the satisfaction of a man who didn't need more information than that. "Okay," he said. "I can work with that. If this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment and tell us which moment got you the most. We read every single one, and it means more than you know. And if you've been watching this channel without subscribing, right now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. We work hard on every story we bring you, and your support is what keeps these coming. Before you go, tap the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. See you in the next one.